back. So, I've had a few requests to do different type of series. I mean, I'm known from Chessable as a openings guy, but all parts of chess are important. Opening, middle game, and end game. And I've done some tactics, and I discuss a good amount of middle game and ideas in my opening videos as extension of the openings, but I rarely ever talk about end games. And I've had requests from a number of my students, so I wanted to pick out a few examples and have a series for you guys based off of endgame principles. And I wanted to kick things off with some king and pawn endgames and then go from there. What we're going to be doing in the examples I'm showing you today is really hit on key themes of king and pawn endgames. This is the level 1 of king and pawn, if you will. And in the future, I'm going to have positions pulled from a number of different books, and we'll walk through step by step to see how these basic principles that we're going to see across many positions apply. Because often I get students who come to me and they go, yeah, I hit 2700 in tactics. And though I'm excited for them, we have these statements in chess that 99% of chess is tactics. And as the game is evolving, I'm inclined to disagree with this, because many positions in chess can be quite devoid of tactics until you get to endgames, where you needed to understand what to trade into or what not to trade to avoid certain endings. And in my opinion, why Magnus Carlsen is the greatest player in the world is because when we're looking at an endgame and we have 12 different moves that are 0.00, he consistently chooses the move that sets the most practical problems for his opponent where they could go wrong to end up in a lost ending. I think he is one of the greatest endgame players of all time from this innate ability. And throughout this series, we're going to talk about how to be nettlesome when you have these endgames to try to turn drawn positions into win and the lost positions into draws. So let's go ahead and dive right in with this starting point in king and pawn endings. And this is one that you see in a lot of endgame books for king and pawn. We look at it and say, if it's white to move, white wins. If it's black to move, the game is a draw. And we're going to see these themes in our first couple of examples, because this is one of the cornerstones of understanding king and pawn endgames. The concept of opposition and getting your pawn up the board. So we should start with goals in any endgame. And we're playing white, and from A1, we're able to recognize that our pawn is going this way. We'd like to turn the pawn into a queen and then checkmate the black king. And with each of these examples, before I get into it, I'd recommend trying to pause and figure it out yourself on your own and then go from there. I personally like to have a training partner that I play in games against or practical games against, because actually experiencing the learning process before studying, you're going to have a better chance of remembering the key ideas, and it's going to stick with you forever. As a educator in my full-time job, I'll definitely say that many individuals don't understand the difference between memorizing and learning. You can't memorize certain tenets of chess. You have to experience it. Sometimes you have to fail doing it, and it lights up those different parts of the brain for you to retain it forever. So, without further ado, E4 would be a terrible way to start, because black is going to be able to reach these key squares before white, and we'll see this concept of opposition. Now, regardless of what white does, we're going to go straight back with black, and we'll see this more in the next example, that it is straight back, and only when the king steps beside the pawn, we step in front of him, and that is the concept of opposition, until we reach this position with stalemate. So coming back to the starting position, how does white win this then? Well, white is going to bring his king up. And only now do we have the opposition. So we are forcing black to make a decision. If black goes back, we will advance and get the opposition. If black goes sideways, we are going to advance so our pawn can be ushered up the board and we're controlling key squares. So in this case, king f6, we're able to play king d5, and now we have a path for this pawn to be ushered up the board. King e7, again, opposition. Now it is multiple ways to win, but we need to calculate at times to assure that we're going to maintain the opposition. For instance, there's a big difference between e3 and e4 in this position. e4, black plays king e7, black has the opposition, and the game is drawn. So first e3, black has the opposition. e4, we gain it back, and now we continue with the process of controlling key squares, opposition, and now we are controlling the key e8 square, and we have this path all the way for our pawn, and there's nothing black can do about it. So push, push, like I said, absolutely nothing. If the king goes here, nothing doing. It's a queen. You cannot capture because you would be moving into check. And that's going to do it for our first example of white getting that opposition and then using outflanking in order to promote the pawn. So on to our next example. And we're looking at it from black's perspective because this is one of the biggest mistakes I think people make when studying endgames. They only look at it from the winning side, and that is normally how most endgame books are written. But in my opinion, we should definitely look at it from the defensive side as well, because you're going to get into the need to hold, need to draw situation, and you're going to know everything white's trying to throw at you. So in this case, we learned from the previous example when we looked at white erroring with 1e4, we're going to go straight back with the king. And only when the white king steps beside the pawn do we step in front of him, getting the opposition. That's all you need to know. In front of the pawn, when the king steps beside the pawn, you want the opposition and be in front of the king, blocking him. No matter how fast your opponent is going or whatever they're trying, if you just follow that, you're good to go. That's what most endgame books need to see or say than just giving you a whole bunch of notation. Because I have actually had 2 wins in tournament play over players between 1600 and 1800 in this position because they were in very bad time trouble, and I shuffled my king around. Say, for instance, if after king e7, instead of king f5, I could make a move like king f4. And you should be staying in front of the pawn. And I'm just trying to trick you. And here, again, straight back. But all it takes is this slight slip. I have the opposition now. And you can very easily go wrong in these situations, is my point. So if you're on the white side of this and your opponent is showing the drawing technique, you can shuffle the king around in different ways without getting a 3-move repetition, fishing for that error. And that's that Magnus Carlsen principle I was talking about. Keep that in mind as you're playing endgames. Don't be in a hurry to push the pawn. In an excellent book on endgames, the complete endgame course from beginner to master, International Master Silman in his master chapter talks about the concept of cat and mouse. And I feel an extension to what he talked about in that is, in modern chess, you've got the 50-move rule. And I'm going to shuffle, shuffle, shuffle to put pressure on my opponent to see if they'll crack over time. And I strongly recommend this type of method when playing. So back to our main example here. We've gone straight back, king e7. And we know when the king steps beside the pawn, we need the opposition to be in front of the king. In front of the pawn, straight back, opposition, and that's how we hold this. and we get our stalemate. On to the next one. And this is a case of distant opposition. So very, very important. White first needs to make a good decision here. If you do not find the correct move, you go from drawn to lost. So this is a pause and take your time. What move would you play with white here? Okay, this goes back to the concept of quote-unquote fools rush in. If we were to move our king up to e4, d4, which is quite natural, black, if white went to e4, is going to go to e6, opposition. And if he goes to d4, it's going to go to d6, opposition. And you've gone from a drawn ending to a lost ending. So we actually need to sidestep with king e3, getting the distant opposition. So when black steps up, direct opposition. And we're going to get a drawn ending as we've seen before. Direct opposition. Direct opposition. Stay in front of the pawn. Straight back. Opposition, because he stepped beside his pawn. Stay in front of the pawn. Straight back. Opposition. And hopefully you're starting to see the theme as I've gone through these examples. Straight in front of the pawn. Straight back. Opposition when he steps beside the pawn. And this is the first theme that you really need mastery of in king and pawn endgames, is understanding this concept of opposition. Let's move on. Okay, the next theme I want to hit on is the square of the pawn. And a lot of people go, I can calculate this. White's pawn is going this way, and black, we need to figure out, all right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and am I going to catch him? Well, you can sit here and calculate this, but chess players learned over time a mental trick in order to save time. Because say you don't have a lot of time on your clock in a practical chess game, you need to be able to look at the position and go, it's a win or it's not, before I trade it down into this ending. Let's say, for instance, we had rooks in the position, and black's rook was here checking us, and I'm able to move my rook over to block and trade rooks. I need to know whether or not I'm winning if I'm bringing the rook off the board. Or say, for instance, if it was white checking and we trade. We're not going to reach this exact position, but hopefully you understand my point. If I foresee an ending that's going to be a draw, I don't want to trade my last rook off. I'm going to try to win with the rooks on the board because I have more winning chances. These are the types of things you need to think about with these endings. So here, we could calculate if a4, can black's king reach the corner? You can pause and calculate this, but let's talk about this trick, this easy mental trick to see point A to B thinking, and how black can save time. So after our first move, a4, we see the square popping up. And this is the concept of the square of the pawn. Now, let me remove the box so we can see how we actually draw the square. You use a bishop's diagonal from the pawn, go beside the pawn, and there's our square. So that's how you actually draw the square of the pawn. And the rule of the square of the pawn is if the defending king can step into the square, then he can catch the pawn in the corner. If he cannot, then the pawn's a runner and it's a girl. It's just happening. Nothing he can do about it. So in this case, king g8, we see the square even smaller. The black king is so far away, nothing doing. Square's even smaller, and we see how it's a queen. So this is a cool mental trick to be able to see drawing the square. If the king isn't in the box, he's not going to be able to catch the pawn. So now we have our next example, and is the black king in the square? Well, we draw our square, and yes, he is in fact in the square of the pawn. So he'll be able to catch it before it reaches the corner. So he's in the square. Yep, definitely in the square. Yahtzee. Next example. Okay, this is one of my favorite little king and pawn examples, the trebuchet example. In this endgame, we see a concept of zugzwang, the position where one side is going to be forced into a bad situation no matter what they do. And this is one of our first examples of how king and pawn in games can be a bit counterintuitive, because in this position, our normal logic with most of the things in life is the best path is a straight line. And you have two examples here. You have king e5 to attack the pawn, or king e6 to attack the base pawn. Our pawn is going this way. One of these wins. One of these loses. It's this important to understand these concepts. So if we approach the pawn the direct way, the straight line path, with king e5, after king c4, we're forced to move away. We lose our pawn, and the king doesn't have time to get back. And it's a girl, and black actually wins. But in the starting position, it's important to go king e6 first to attack the pawn. So when black plays defense here, I'm forcing the king away. And it's actually the better example. King c4 is the win. If king e5, king b5, king takes e5. The game is actually drawn after king c6, understanding that king c4 is a loss. After king e5, not king d7, remember the concept of opposition, but king c7, so that white grabs the pawn. We're back in opposition, and this is a draw. So, practical problems against our opponents. From the starting example, the position objectively may be drawn, but understanding that difference between king e5 and king e6 gives you winning chances. King e5, busted on the spot. On to the next one. All right, so we've got our first example with rook pawns, and the more you study chess in games, the more you'll understand that rook pawns make it difficult to win. And in many of rook pawn examples, all you have to do, if you're on the defending side, is get to the queening square of the pawn and then stay attached to it. Just keep staying attached to it, and that's all you need to know. And let's see an example of this here. So white's trying to make progress. He has the opposition, but it means nothing here. So I'm just going to go in the corner, and I'm going to stay attached to the corner. And nothing doing, I get stalemated. So very simple process understanding, playing the defensive side of this ending. Next up, we've got example of, we know that if the black king can reach the corner, that it's a draw. So our goal with white should be to body check black and make sure he can't reach the corner. So let's first start with king g4. And we see white's idea is going to be to keep the black king out. So as he is rushing over here, he's trying to get up there. Boom, very, very important move. Got that body check, and now our pawn is a runner, and here it comes. It's a girl. So, body checking, not always taking the most direct path, going at an angle to make sure that the other king is blocked out. Very, very important principle in king and pawn endgames. So now we have another one. Another rook and pawn example. And those experienced in endgames will look at this position and immediately know whether this is a win or a draw. So how? How can you look at this? You go, well, of course it's a win. There's an extra bishop. No, not necessarily. The corner color queening square matters here. So what do I mean? Well, the corner color queening square is a light square. We have a dark square bishop. In fact, this is a very interesting position because I could put bishops, if, say, the black king was on A8, I could put bishops on every dark square on the board, and it would not change the evaluation of this position as a draw. It's kind of ridiculous, but let's just see it. So as I'm trying to push my pawn forward, as we've seen before, the theme is, again, all I needed to know for the defensive side is I stay attached to the corner square, the queening square. And bishop f4, well, if white just, say, moves the bishop, that's stalemate. And if he pushes the pawn, that's stalemate. If he moves the king away, I just keep moving back and forth. White has no way to force black out of the queening square, even with the extra bishop. That's why in games where, say for instance, if we roll it back, and let me see if I can't give us an example this way. If you have a position like this, and it is white to move, we could very easily see white go, all right, I need to get my passers running and play b4. Well, the black knight can sacrifice on b4, resulting in this drawn ending. So even though white could be 2 pawns up, it could still be beneficial to try to play out these endings because you know what to trade down into in order to hold. That's why it's so important to learn these basic ending positions, because you know where you're trying to head. All right, next example. Okay, in this one, the white pawn, again, is traveling in this direction. We need to make sure that the black king isn't able to just simply go king c4 and capture our pawn, because that's a draw. The bishop on its own cannot win. So, very important move to start things off. We must prevent the black king from getting to c4. So we actually sacrifice our bishop in order for our king to get opposition and get the key square. And now opposition. And we're back to the theme that we saw in the introduction. So do not be afraid in endgames to give up material in order to get to a desired position. I find that a lot of my students, when they're starting out, can be too materialistic when evaluating positions. And I'm willing to give up anything on the board, except my king, in order to win. Keep that in mind. So, another fantastic example. Pause and see if you can't figure out what to do with white if you've never seen this position before. This is another classic example that if you've seen it before, it's very impressive and it gets burned into your memory. If white decides to play passively and say plays king b1, well, black is just going to continue this opposition train until reaching probably here. And then he's going to go after the pawns and gobble, gobble, gobble. And then it's going to be the 3-0 special, which even with 1 pawn, it should be enough. But 2 pawns? Definitely enough. 3 pawns? Yes. It's just going to be an easy win for black. But in fact, white is completely winning in this position with a beautiful breakthrough idea that you need to know in king and pawn endgames. So breakthrough ideas are essential, because it will look as if the pawns are locked up and there's nothing that can be done. But essentially, if you could get 1 runner, that's going to be it. It's a girl. So g6 to start things off. You go, well, after I take, aren't I just a pawn up? Nay, because push. In one way or another, we're creating a passer with this breakthrough. If g takes f6, h6, and it's a queen. If g takes h5, f takes g6, it's a queen on the next move. And coming back to the starting position, if f takes g6, h6 with the same theme. If the g-pawn takes, the f-pawn is a runner. If the g-pawn takes, the h-pawn takes g and is a runner and becomes a queen. So we see this magical breakthrough starting with g6, and king and pawn breakthroughs, very, very important theme to keep in the noggin. Next up, the outside passer. And I'm going to use another term that International Master Silman used in his great book, fox in the chicken coop, or expression rather. If you're worried about the outside passer with the king, and you're going after him, my king is going to be going up and eliminating all of your guys. So outside passers are very useful in king and pawn endgames. So let's see in this brief example. I am not touching the pawn so quickly because I want black to have to worry about it and go after it. And as we see, we've got the opposition. We can force black to run out of moves here. And his king is eventually going to have to yield the d5 square to us. Or, if he decides to try to stay with his pawn mass, we then are beginning to run our passer, and one way or another, he's going to have to react to it. And that's when he's going to yield the d5 square. So in this case, after h5, let's make sure this pawn is not going to move again. h4. We fix the pawn. On f6, okay, copycat, f3. You're going to run out of moves. g6. I personally would deviate from the main game here and probably play g3, but a4 works just the same. After g5, takes, a5, and after g4, takes, g3 locks it up where he can never move again, but a6 works just fine as black has finally yielded the key squares, and we've got the 2 for none special, and we're simply getting all the way up the board. And this example didn't have the most optimal play for either side, in my opinion, but it's still a useful example in the end game with that distraction concept. While you're dealing with this over here, sneakily going to the other side of the board. Okay, so now we've got another example with distant opposition, and it's very important here to choose the key square that is going to give you that distant opposition. So king b7, distant opposition. And let's take a look at if he goes king f8. Well, king c6, looking to do some outflanking. King c7, got the opposition again. On king f6, not king d6, but king d8. Because king d6, we're moving into black having the opposition, and I mean, it more than likely we're still fine there, but king d8, opposition, king e6, and we have this outflanking, king h7, king f7 with opposition. And now I love this next move. You go, well, if we just go king f6, he's going to go king h7, and this is going to be a draw. Nuh-uh-uh. King g8. We actually put black in stalemate here. But it's not stalemate because he can move his g-pawn. And the only move he has is to give us this pawn for free. Check. King f8. And now we control the path of the pawn. And in fact, you can even push this guy here because only move for black. Check. Queen. And checkmate. Very clean way to end this. So again, importance of opposition, importance of outflanking. In this next example, we're pulling a game where two legendary grandmasters of chess are playing, and we'll look at it from Black's perspective. We've got Sveshnikov with White, and the legend, Scary Gary Kasparov, with Black. And what I wanted you to see with this example is paralysis can really hurt the opponent and leave them limited for options. Well, the weakest part of a pawn chain is the base. So Gary first starts off with king b4, rushing to get to the a2 pawn and get the base. Now, we've optimized our king placement versus White, and we need to create a plan here. If only we could create a scenario where all of these pawns are gone and we have the opposition. So we're able to just run over, clip the base pawn, and then the whole pawn chain falls. So we want to optimize our movements to make sure that we are getting that opposition. Otherwise, the game is going to be a draw. a5, a4. Very important. Take with the king. We need to exchange all the pawns on the queen wing. If king b1, king a3 again, b4, b3, and there's our opposition. If White was to try king a1, we can actually go b takes a2, and this gets that lovely theme again of we stalemated him, but he can still move other things. So after b3, a takes b3, and we see as we're able to go and collect. So coming back, if king b2, for instance, b4, king c2, king a3, and we're back to the same theme again. And if a3, b3, and we're back to this stalemating theme where he has moves he can make, and checkmate. So very, very nice example by Kasparov showing how that paralysis of the opponent can be absolutely devastating. And we've got another example here with White to move, and I believe this is our final example. If not, we're getting pretty close. How can White hold this position? Because only one move is going to be able to hold it here. So put together some of the concepts that we've worked on before and see if you can't come up with the best move. All right, so hopefully you did the pause to try to figure this out. And we need to assure that we're going to be getting the opposition. So you first actually start by giving away your pawn with e5. Now after captures, remember if we step up, Black gets the opposition. Distant opposition though, sidestep. And when Black steps up, we have the opposition. We're in front of the pawn, and we're back to that theme that we looked at when we first started these examples. With stalemate, and we've got a few more. It is 2 more examples after this. This example is concept in king and pawn endgames, triangulation. We actually, in this position, want it to be Black's move, but it's White's move. If it was Black to move, he would move away from control over the g6 square. Our king would go in, we'd clip the h6 pawn, we've got the 2 for none special, and then we're going to win. Well, in this case, it's White's move. But we have more squares than Black has to work with. So we're going to shuffle our king in order to get back to this position and force Black to move away. So let's first start with king e5, as we're going to see the triangle. And on king f8, not king f5, because king f7, and we've just transposed back to the initial position. We're actually going to go king f4. And now on king e8, king e4, king f8, king e5. Now, he's got to be careful because if king f7, we get what we want. And if king e8, king e6, and rook. Don't be in a hurry to get the queen all the time. Getting a queen here would actually be stalemate, but we've left him one square. And now it should be pretty trivial after that. Let's go ahead and get the king in there and get that checkmate. So our, I believe, this time, don't quote me yet, the final example. So this one is a classical example in king and pawn endgame, seen in almost all the books. White's pawn's going this way, and it looks very easy for black to catch. Black's pawn is going this way, and with our king behind it, it looks impossible to catch. So this is a misdirection exercise. First, we need to go king g7 as we're getting closer to both pawns. And this is that key concept. h4, king f6, and now after this move, black can either choose to queen his h-pawn or stop the f-pawn with his king. And let's look at both lines to make sure we're understanding. So if king b6, king e5, key move, because if black simply captures, now we're in the square of the pawn. And you're not going anywhere. So coming back, if king b6, what if h3? It's going to queen. We come back to defend our pawn, and we're queening at the same time for a draw. Very, very, very important concept. So what about instead of king b6, h3? Same theme, c7. If the black king approaches, so do we. We queen with check. Draw. And if c7, again, we have a drawn position. So, nope, I lied. I 100% know that this is the last of the last. This is the last one. I apologize. When you have a lot of examples and you looked at them in advance and you don't have some sort of little marker beside you, you can lose track of how many positions. But this absolutely beautiful example is the final one. And if it's not, I'm cutting off the video. So here, let's put together a lot of what we've looked at. Opposition, outflanking. Let's get it. So white's pawns want to go this way for the win. But if we're too quick to push, we may, in fact, lose this game. So say if we played a move like c5, black is going to collect, move out of the way, and then queen his pawn. So we're going to have to dance the dance here. We're not touching our pawn. But in the meantime, if black's king tries to make a mad rush all the way down, our king is going to come up, and we're going to queen our c-pawn. So we're just going to simply sidestep. And black's king is going to need to make sure that we're staying on the back wall, but he can't. Because as soon as we get to the corner, now black needs to worry about the square of the pawn. Because if he goes to h6, he's out of the square of the pawn and he can't catch our runner. It's a girl. So now after king h8, he needs to come back. Now we have that diagonal opposition. And we're able to use the concept of the square of the pawn again. Because if king f3, we got a runner. And I really like this one. So after king h3, king f5, and now our king is in a much better position than when it started. We have our opposition, and with it, we are going to win the game. And we got the 2 for none. So hopefully you have enjoyed this introduction to king and pawn endgames. I scoured multiple different sources to put together these examples, and we're definitely, after this first video, going to be diving into more difficult positions and breaking down these concepts even further. Because once you have the basics down, then you've got to constantly practice them with more difficult positions to gain mastery. In modern chess, it's getting faster and faster. And if you can't do it in a blitz game, you can't do it. So that's my philosophy with studying endings. It's always great when a player has time to think because they can make it happen. But not all games are going to be FIDE rated with a 30-second increment and really as much time as you need to think in a given position. So study your endgames practically, study from the defensive side, and let's keep going in future videos. Thanks.